If you're skimming headlines in 2018, you'd think Trump was attempting to turn space exploration into an episode of Star Trek. The Americans got the Navy, the military, the Air Force, and now they've got a Space Force, which has taken on some of the Air Force's operations. Worth noting that the Air Force have been performing space-related activities since the 60s, but now those operations are under a new, really expensive umbrella. Unfortunately, the United States Space Force isn't building a Death Star or a tractor beam, it's instead ensuring several satellites don't get damaged or destroyed. Although when this information was made public, the hilarious thing at the time was the way Donald dealt with the media. He announced that America needed dominance in space. It's the type of discourse that attempts to indoctrinate patriotism. I hate it and it makes my skin crawl. And although it's as clear as day that Donald is a complete moron, as it turns out, satellite protection is quite important. Without satellites, you wouldn't be able to get an Uber or go on your next Tinder date. That's because satellites relay important GPS information, which we've all become dependent upon for our day-to-day activities. They also have a military spying function, which is the reason the whole thing is ethically problematic. But it's important to remember that the US has historically used outer space in ways that can benefit their warfighting capabilities. That's to say, reconnaissance satellites aren't a new thing, they're just a new thing for Space Force. And while there's an argument that having a Space Force is a solution in search of a problem, when it's all weighed up, Russia have formed an aerospace force in 2015 and China have consolidated something similar called the PLA. The Americans have actually been hitchhiking rides on Russian rockets for a while. My point is there's a tangible reason for the US to develop further infrastructure which enables space travel, a position which was mocked by a number of liberal comedians and talk show hosts at the time. But the point I'm trying to make is it's not the silliest of proposals. Neil deGrasse Tyson put it really well. He said, just because it came out of Trump's mouth doesn't make it all that stupid. I wouldn't chastise anybody who's failed to arrive at that assumption, but I would argue Space Force serves a purpose. I would ask you to consider that logic before I move towards the review, because I think that's the overarching problem the show's combating in its attempts to make a more purposeful comedy. So Steve Carrell and Greg Daniels have taken Trump's remarks and created a 10-part comedy which parodies the service people and scientists responsible for creating a space force. The show centres on a recently promoted 4-star general, Mark Naird, who's responsible for figuring out the day-to-day of what a space force actually does. I'll start by saying I was surprised by how safe the humour is in the show. It isn't as politically savage as a show circling Trump-era politics needs to be in 2020. The reason it's not punching as hard as it should be is quite simple. It's just the name Space Force that's funny. It turns out the activities of Space Force aren't all that ridiculous. It's technically a competent satire because it positions itself in a way that allows it to ridicule everybody. It makes China as much of an enemy as several American military personalities who just want to bomb everything. Although the problem is it gets quite comfortable sitting on the fence poking fun at everybody, which is fine I suppose, but in my heart of hearts I wanted the story to stab at Donald a little harder. It only starts to form the political narrative that it should be more confident in telling during the concluding episodes, but at that point it's too little too late. It's a little afraid of overstepping the line weirdly. You never see the president in the entire show. The chief of staff, played by Steve Carrell, only gets text messages from a POTUS acronym. You get a sense that Trump's operating from the shadows, but it never quite graduates to being the anarchic takedown that other more brilliant satirists have created in recent years. It definitely wants to be an anti-Trump comedy. You can tell from the types of text messages Carrell's character receives from the president, but it's too afraid to be an executioner. Unfortunately, it's more concerned with being a wacky comedy that only dips its feet in some of the more substantial issues surrounding Space Force's formation. The annoying thing is, when the show has the confidence to be a political drama, it's much more successful whenever the characters are discussing Space Force's expenditure or the necessity of weapons in space. In these moments it feels more purposeful and focused. In the 3rd episode, Carrell's character presents a budget expansion before Congress, and it at least makes an attempt to interrogate something more substantial. As it goes on, the content of the episodes feels more like filler between a beginning and an end. The characters start messing around with exoskeletons and trying out budget rocket fuel, but the antics soon become tedious. and you wonder where it's all heading. It's consistently attempting to not alienate any audience, which is really counterintuitive. It's pretty content with being an unremarkable Greg Daniels streaming comedy like his previous show Upload. It's frustrating because Steve Carrell and Greg Daniels are better writers than this. Ultimately, they were responsible for giving the US office its own identity, but there's none of that magic here, unfortunately. Space Force is a workplace comedy, but it lacks the mundane charm that The Office oozes, which you debatably need to make a show that operates within this genre. It's that mockumentary style that's done spades for Daniels in the past. I don't know why he hasn't stuck to a formula that works. Unlike The Office, the show has HBO-level production values, and all the workplace comedy tropes have been removed in favour of making it more filmic. In the second episode, there's a CGI chimpanzee trying to fix a satellite, which the Chinese military have sabotaged. It's a funny idea, but it feels like so much money has been invested on the special effects in what could have been a much simpler gag if it had been conducted over an intercom. Instead, it's given an entire episode and really dazzling production values, which are really distracting and ultimately detract from the gag itself. The episodes have this rhythm in which Carrell's character will fall out with one of his advisors, then he'll have a family issue. He learns from these experiences and then he'll make up with everyone at the end of the episode, which is only 30 minutes long. After a couple of episodes, it becomes a really predictable story arc. I wouldn't be thinking about the structure if it was funnier, but there's 3 or 4 laughs over 10 episodes. It relies very heavily on gags revolving around the armed forces being stupid, but a lot of the humour is cringeworthy, and not in a Larry David or Ricky Gervais way, in a legitimately this is terrible sort of way, which makes it difficult to stick to at times. I think it's not as rebellious as it needs to be. I think to do a modern satire properly, you have to present quite extreme characters to drive your point home in a more meaningful way. Does anybody want a safe satire in 2020? Even The Simpsons has had to get edgier in recent years. I just don't think anybody wanted this. Waste a lot of time developing a lot of supporting characters, which are comprised of really annoying personalities. They're just not funny or substantial enough or memorable, and it frequently wastes time developing in areas that could have been cut out in favour of making a more focused film. I think you could cut together the first couple of episodes with the last 2 and it would be a serviceable comedy, but in the way it's been presented, it feels so overstretched. I recently watched Steve Carell play a political consultant in Jon Stewart's debut film Irresistible, and it's a film with a message about the disconnect between champagne socialists in New York and Republican voters in rural areas like Wisconsin. It's got a really clear central message about the millions of dollars pumped into political campaigns which could be better spent on benefiting local communities. The whole film basically says, imagine if that money was spent on schools and hospitals. Similarly, it's a Steve Carell-led satire which I think is more effective because of its shorter runtime. Altogether, I found the whole thing to be really disappointing. It's not as bad as an Adam Sandler film by any stretch. It's not offensive, but the whole thing feels like it stemmed from one funny joke, a silly name, although unfortunately it's an idea that doesn't have all that much to it. My thoughts aside, the general consensus is that it's pretty terrible, and I think that's because everyone was expecting something with a bit more bite. I know I certainly was. Matt Stone and Trey Parker maybe left this particular idea for the sole reason that it doesn't work, even though it seemed like it might have a few years ago. But that's going to be all from me today. Thank you so much for watching the video. Remember to drop me a like if you enjoyed what you watched here today. Looking at the not too distant future, I'm going to be reviewing my favourite story of 2020 so far, so make sure you're subscribed so you get a notification bell to see that video when that comes out. But yeah, guys, that's going to be all from me today. Thank you so much again for watching the video, and yes, till next time, peace.